Salve Greece and Rome students, welcome back. Hope you guys had an excellent weekend here. We are back to finish up chapter 11. We are really on the home stretch because we're going to finish up chapter 11 today. We're almost done with it. And then we have chapter 12 this week, and then we'll be ready for our next test. And after that, we just have one more test on chapters 13 and 14. So we're definitely on the home stretch and getting through a lot of history over the next few chapters. So make sure to stay with me and let me know if you have questions as we go along about the chapters. Today I want to take you through the end of chapter 11. Last emperor we saw was Macrinus, and he became emperor basically by killing Caracalla, his predecessor, if you remember. So it was basically a military coup, and Macrinus was emperor for about a year. We talked about last time that he was eventually killed at the scheming basically of some other people, and he was eventually killed by his own troops, who had been turned by a woman who claimed that Caracalla was the father of her son, and so her son was proclaimed emperor by people thinking he was Caracalla's son. We say alleged son because there are some historians who think that was just made up to give him a family connection to Caracalla to make him seem more legitimate, that he wasn't actually the son, but I'm not sure if we can say 100% for that. But this 14-year-old who became emperor, and again, we're getting into some younger emperors here in this time period. The next emperor we call Elagabalus, right? Elagabalus. And that's certainly a weird name. That's one of the emperor's names. Doesn't sound very Roman, and there's a reason for that. It wasn't a Roman name. Elagabalus was kind of an odd emperor. He was, like I said, young when he was brought up, and he lived in the East his whole life, or most of his life. He was not born and raised in Rome. He lived in the East, and so he had picked up some Eastern ways and traditions and whatnot, and he had grown up to be kind of fervently devoted to more of an Eastern religion. So in particular, he had devotion to a specific Syrian sun god called Elagabal, and that was kind of his more who he followed fervently. And so he took his name from this god that he worshipped, this would have been a weird thing to people back in Rome, hearing that their emperor was infatuated with a Syrian sun god. But we'll talk about that. His real name he adopted when he became emperor was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, and he adopted that because, you remember, that was Caracalla's name. So it's supposed to say, this is my father, and I'm going to take his name to kind of give him a connection to that family. We've seen that over and over, emperors adopting names to make themselves seem more legitimate. That was kind of a thing back then. But he was one of Rome's stranger emperors. His mother and grandmother were both kind of behind the scenes scheming to get him put into power. They were the ones who turned some of the soldiers against Macrinus. And his grandmother was called Julia Maesa, and his mother was Julia Simois. And so they were kind of both in the background and played a big role. They wanted to play a big role because obviously he was 14 when he becomes emperor. He's going to need some help to see things through. As you can see, it didn't last that long. He was only emperor about 4 years. After becoming emperor in the East, because he was in the East whenever Macrinus was killed and he was declared emperor in the East, actually the Senate had still recognized Macrinus as emperor throughout the little struggle, and so they sent word back to Rome that Macrinus was dead and Elagabalus was now emperor, but basically the senators would be forgiven for their not listening to Elagabalus, etc. So he came back to Rome to basically take his position as emperor. When he returned to Rome, it seemed like the Romans didn't take to him. He seemed weird. He seemed very foreign to them. He seemed kind of separated. Again, he had never spent a lot of his life in Rome, and especially his obsession with this Syrian sun god seemed weird to them because most Romans were members of the traditional Roman religion. He was also not super interested in just the everyday, governing, right? I think most 14, 15, 16-year-olds, it'd be hard to focus on governmental matters all day. He was more focused on religious rituals and seemed to be, again, very infatuated with the Syrian religion. The senators also didn't seem to take to him, right? They begrudgingly accepted him as emperor at first, but they, over time, depicted him more as a tyrant, and they kind of depicted it as he was just like, he was just a figurehead, and his mother and grandmother were pulling his strings, and they were the real power behind the throne. Eventually, what happens to Elagabalus, we don't have that much he did during his reign because he's only emperor for a few years. Eventually, he is murdered by the Praetorians, but it seems they were bribed by his own aunt, actually, called Julia Maimea. There's a lot of Julias, so we have to differentiate between them. Julia Maimea, she bribed the Praetorian Guard to murder Elagabalus and also his mother, because she knew his mother, of course, would never forget that. And she had her own son called Alexianus at the time, proclaimed emperor. So we have again, kind of a lot of bitter power struggles here between these elites. Now, her son that becomes the next emperor, Alexianus, he takes the name Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, and we call him Severus Alexander usually. And again, you can see he adopts some names. Marcus Aurelius here. He connects himself to the Severan family. Because Septimius Severus was so popular. He ruled for longer, as you can see. He had a good 13-year rule, but he was also very young whenever his mother schemed to have him become emperor. Very young. He was only 14. His mother, again, we call it Julia Mimea, and she was very heavily involved. She was one of these, there's a few women throughout Roman history that are very, very up in the business of state, like Livia and Agrippina the Younger we talked about. Julia Mimea was one of those. Severus Alexander lasted longer, at least. He was more respectful to the Senate than the last few predecessors had been. He placed some senators in key positions, including putting a senator as Praetorian prefect. We talked about long ago, emperors had stopped doing that because they were, perhaps too ambitious and whatnot. Also, this was a good time for jurisprudence, which means like the courts and the legal system and the body of law grew a lot and became sharpened and honed during this time. So his reign, at least, was peaceful enough and effective enough for that to happen. He also seemed, at least or his administration paid attention to economic and social concerns. They were somewhat focused on the people, which we talked about. You have to at least give off that appearance that you're working for people, you're trying, you're not, even if it's not a perfect administration, you're trying to make people's lives better. So, for example, some taxes were reduced during the reign of Severus Alexander. The grain supply was effectively run and was usually there for people, and certain scholarship even began to be subsidized, bringing people to Rome who were kind of some of the smartest people in the empire to advise Alexander and to study in Rome, etc. So relatively successful reign compared to Elagabalus. Now, as far as the military goes, the relationship was a little more problematic. He seemed to not be respected by the soldiers. It's kind of easy to imagine why this would be. He became emperor when he was 14. It's probably for some grizzled soldiers respecting a new 14-year-old. But there's some other reasons for this. Shortly into his reign, when he was only about a year or so into his reign, the Praetorians killed their own prefect called Ulpian. Alexander looked into it, but did not end up punishing the people who were involved. And maybe the soldiers, this might have been a sign to them that he was weak and ineffective, that he wouldn't punish here. But he was active militarily. He did go out with the soldiers during certain times. He campaigned against the Sasanians. Remember, we talked about them, that dynasty overtaking the Parthians in the east. He campaigned aggressively against them. Their king, King Ardashir I, had invaded Mesopotamia. Alexander recovered it by the next year, 232, and went back and had a big triumph in Rome. So, large triumph for Alexander. He also campaigned against the Germans in 235. This wasn't quite as successful. He basically ran out of steam and wasn't able to defeat them. And he began to negotiate, call the Germans to the negotiating table. And his soldiers, again, this might have been something they didn't respect about him. It was seen as cowardly unless you had a really good reason to negotiate with the Germans and not to fight them. Eventually, he was killed in a mutiny by some mutinous soldiers, and they killed him and also his mother, again, who had been kind of behind his whole reign. The emperor who these soldiers installed after Severus Alexander was called Gaius Julius Varius Maximinus. We usually call him Maximinus Thrax. That's what we'll call him when we get into him. That'll be next chapter when we talk about Maximinus Thrax. But the significant was Maximinus Thrax was that he was an equestrian, and we call him the first of the soldier emperors, or sometimes barracks emperors. And basically, over the next 50 years or so, you're going to have basically soldiers who think they can be emperor and think they can seize power, and they'll kill their predecessor, and then basically it's like brute strength declaring themselves emperor. So over the next 50 years or so, this is called the crisis of the 3rd century, where emperors are changing so much, things are in such a state of crazy flux that Rome is kind of just teetering on the edge because no one's paying attention to government, no one's paying attention to the administration of the city and grain supply. The empire is just kind of in chaos because it's just emperor for a year and then he gets killed, and this guy's emperor for 6 months and he gets killed, and there's just kind of a, with a few little breaks, but there's mostly 50 years of chaos that we're about to get into, and that's very famously called the crisis of the third century. Usually the reign of Maximinus Fax is what we call the first of the Barracks emperors, and we're going to see more of them, but that will be the next chapter. So that's where we'll head. The last part of this chapter, though, is to talk about the emergence and kind of the relationship between Rome and Christianity, which we've alluded to a little bit and talked about here and there. But of course, as Christianity grows as a religion, we want to kind of follow it along and make sure we know kind of how it's growing, how it's interacting. That's one of the more interesting things, is how does Christianity interact with Rome and Roman religion, Roman government? How did they fit in Roman society? Because a lot of times when, I don't know, if you're reading the Bible or something, you don't remember that, like, these early Christians, they were all living in the Roman Empire. They were all, they weren't necessarily all Roman citizens, but some of them were. They were all living in the Roman Empire. They were all connected to Rome very closely. So in Rome, there had always been a big, close connection between religion and politics, right? It was not separated for the most part like it is nowadays. Religious ceremonies would basically happen at political activities, and the emperor was the Pontifex Maximus, as we mentioned. So they were just kind of intertwined, politics and religion, and this might have affected some of the intensity of relations. Once things get a little dicey between pagans and Christians, it might have been that the pagans saw that Christians were not only, assaulting maybe their religious way of life, but also they're not respecting the Roman state, because those things were so closely intertwined together. In general, we've talked before about Roman subjects in general, when Rome, took over control of an area. In general, they didn't force too many things upon you. You could still believe in your original religion as long as your religious rituals weren't mutinous or politically dangerous, and as long as you didn't outright reject the Roman religion and just kind of blaspheme against it or something. So this was a little bit of a trouble for Christians and Jews, because they couldn't do some of the things that the Roman religion usually required, right? Christians, if you were a professed Christian, you couldn't really participate in some sort of state ritual, even if there's a governmental ritual, but it's involve some sort of sacrifice to the gods or something. You could not be involved in that if you really wanted to be kind of a serious Christian. I'm sorry, I'll move myself out of the way. I didn't realize I was in the way there. So, this was an issue. This is why early on during this time period and up until then, there weren't a lot of Christians in government, because if you were a Christian in government, you had to make a choice between keeping true to your religion or going through with these rituals. It was just assumed if you were in the government, you were doing these things. We talked about Romans were initially considered basically kind of an offshoot of Judaism, but Christians rejected this, and eventually it was realized by Rome that it was something different and kind of growing into a bigger thing. You did have, we already talked about in the first century, we had, of course, Nero persecuting Christians, so that's happened before, but it kind of goes in waves. During the period of the five good emperors, there was very little certainly very little state persecution, but there were outbreaks of persecution and violence in localized areas. So you might have a city or a town where there's kind of outbreaks of violence between pagans and Christians would go through persecution. It might not have been done by the government, but it might have been done by local citizens or local groups. Not initiated by the state. Eventually, we are going to get to more persecutions initiated actually by the government, like government policy. But from 120 to 220, it's mostly smaller groups persecuting Christians in certain parts of the empire. In other parts of the empire, Christians are living safely, depending on where you lived and when you lived. This is kind of the rise of Christian apologists, which is a term to be someone who defends a religion, basically. And Christian apologists at this time started writing these really clever essays, and we still have some of them from Christian writers at this time, not all of them, but these essays seem not so much to be like things about, hey, everyone should become Christian, but more about defending Christianity against charges that had been made and trying to convince Romans that Christians were not something that Rome should be afraid of. So they were less proselytizing and more of just kind of defending the religion from detractors. So as far as the geography, until the late 2nd century or so, most Christians lived in the east more. It was, that's kind of makes sense. That's where that's where Jesus lived, and that's where kind of Christ's mission and his ministry were. So it makes sense. And later on, it kind of spread also to bigger cities, Rome and Carthage, and bigger cities. But we talked about rural areas. Certainly, it was the last place to hit was rural areas. So it started in the east, then it spread to big cities, and it took a long time to hit, tiny villages and farms and things like that. The church by this time has become, it's still a minority, a very small minority, but it's become more sophisticated. They have meetings to discuss spiritual concepts, hierarchy. There's priests and bishops and etc. During the Severan period, Christianity kind of kept growing, and it gained its first equestrian members, its first senatorial members, which is interesting. And the religion of Christianity seemed to be particularly enticing to women. A lot of women joined Christianity even before men did. Not that there were no men, but just it held some allure. And we'll talk about in the next slide why there was a lot of women that were drawn to Christianity. It's hard to estimate the numbers of Christianity. We don't even have really a good guess because it was just such an underground thing. It was not really something they would be able to publish any sort of census about. The census didn't ask you whether you're a Christian because that was just not an official thing. As we get into the mid 3rd century and early 4th centuries, we're going to have the Roman state, and we haven't gotten there in time yet, so we'll eventually get there. But we have more of an active persecution of Christians by the actual government, making it government policy. We'll talk about which emperors did that, why they did that, but we're getting very close to that time period. And with Maximinus Thrax, we just ended with him. We're getting close to that, right? The reasons the state would, claim they were doing this, they would say that Christians were a menace to society, and some of their policies, Christian policies, were not conducive to Roman society. And one way they would sometimes try to root Christians out, or if they wanted to figure out who was a Christian, or this actually became government policy eventually. Sometimes they would require in certain areas that you had to, every so often, every year, or whatever the policy was, make a mandatory public sacrifice to the Roman gods. Of course, this is something that Christians would refuse to do. Or I should say, it'd be a hard thing, because let's say you are a Christian and you sincerely believe it. Maybe some people are scared of what would happen to them, and so they just do it even though they know it's wrong. I mean, it's hard to put yourself in their shoes. Certainly, there would be some Christians who would refuse to do it, and they would be outed as Christians, and they could be punished. Their property could be seized. There was even execution, exile. It depends on where you were and how, the empire is so big. It depends on where you were and how active the governor was in doing these things. But certainly, it could lead to very, very serious consequences for you. So you had to make the decision, if you're a Christian, do I basically come out with it? Do I kind of hide it? What can I do there? In some places, there was even these certificates called labelli. Labelli were a certificate given to you basically after you sacrificed to the Roman gods. It proved that you had done this sacrifice, and it was almost like okay, I'm good to go as far as the Roman religion. I've made my sacrifices. I proved that I'm not a Christian in case there's ever any questions about that. And again, to get into government, you might need to show something like that, because we talked about you had to at least be willing to do certain things in the Roman religion to be in government. Christians, if it was known that you were a Christian, of course, there might have been some that kind of served on the down low, but Christians in general could not serve in the army. You could not be in any important public positions because of the reasons we already talked about that. And this is where we start having, we've had some before, of course, during the reign of Nero, but this becomes more the 3rd century is where we really get the rise of Christian martyrs. And martyr comes from the Greek word that means witness. And basically, a martyr is someone who is killed for their faith, basically. It's associated with Christianity a lot. And there were some who basically, it was almost seen as obviously not everyone would go for it, but there were some who volunteered for martyrdom because they saw it was kind of a badge of honor to die for their faith, and they would not want to deny that they were Christians. Even though being killed for your religion was a really bad thing, if it happened to you, of course, it kind of made Christianity grow a bit, these martyrs, because these martyrs, even nowadays, we look back on some of the Christian martyrs, we still know their names, we still know what they did, we still talk about them, and they kind of are a rallying cry. You can rally around these people and say, hey, if they were strong in this situation, I can be strong in this other situation. So the persecutions, oddly, even though they were rough, they strengthened Christianity, because anytime a group is kind of in trouble or threatened like this, it kind of brings them closer together. They feel closer to other Christians and makes them a more cohesive unit. So what was drawing people to Christianity? Because it is growing a lot this time. Again, there's still plenty of pagans, but Christianity is growing. And we mentioned how women were a little more likely to join it early on. So what was the appeal here? Well, the Christian church was involved in aid to uh, the lower stratuses of society. So they delivered aid and help and food and things like that to widows, orphans, the very poor, etc. And some people were just kind of drawn to that altruistic nature of the religion. They also ignored differences of social or political status. So this was, early on, we mentioned how there were some senatorial and equestrian converts, but early on, Christianity grew much more with the lower classes because it was a religion that preached everyone is equal and everyone is the same in the eyes of God, etc. And certainly, if you were kind of on the bottom strata of society, that would be a very appealing thing to you. Also, women played a much more active role in the Christian church than they could in almost any other area of society. So that's why some women flocked to the church because it just seemed a little more equal and something they would be respected in. If you were a Roman hearing about Christianity, again, it was still a small minority of people, so you would hear things here and there, but it wasn't an official religion. So some of the reasons it might have been misunderstood, and maybe some Romans were, skeptical or nervous about it, was there was these stories of when Christians got into their ceremonies, there was no big open churches at this time. It was mostly done in people's homes and kind of underground like that. But there were stories that they would eat the body and blood of their Savior, right? Now we know nowadays, and Christians knew that this is talking about the Eucharist, like we do during our Eucharist, right, where you eat bread and drink wine. But if you just kind of hear that and you don't have any context, you might be thinking, are they actually eating flesh and drinking blood? And so there is basically accusations of cannibalism. Okay, it seems silly nowadays, but if you just hear a little bit about it, you know how rumors start, and this could be another rumor that goes around Rome. They also tended to call each other brother and sister. That was the thing about Christians. And so some people said, was there incest going on between these Christians? Assuming there's a lot of brothers and sisters here. Again, it just was a misunderstanding of the Christian religion. And also, there were some Romans who were skeptical that there were so many lower class Christians. Again, we talked about why that would be, but some people just said, why are so many of the downtrodden in society flocking to this? Is it some sort of fomenting some sort of rebellion or anti-government sentiment or something like that? So but it kind of steadily grew. We don't want to say it exploded, but it steadily grew, and we'll keep monitoring the growth of Christianity as we follow along with Roman history. Okay, but we will stop there for today because that is the last part of this chapter. So thank you guys for following along. Make sure you've done all of chapter 11, and we'll probably do an assignment tomorrow for chapter 11, and then we'll get on to chapter 12. I'm anxious to get through the crisis of the 3rd century. We don't get into every emperor because there's about 20 something emperors in about 50 years. It's a little chaotic. Some of them are only emperor for a few months, but we do get into some of the bigger ones during that time period. So I'll be back with you guys very soon to go over chapter 12. Hope you're doing very well, and we're definitely at crunch time here. So come by, see me in my office hours if you want to talk about this chapter or really talk about anything. I'd love to see you guys, and I'll be back and talk to you soon. Well, later.